Today's terrifying story, The Gravedigger's Last Job, was written by Divil59 of Reddit. I worked as a gravedigger for a lot of my life. I'm aware it seems like a dated profession, and one that's rather clandestine, all things considered. But, honest work or not, it was fiscally rewarding enough to help me place food on the table, to earn a deposit and a steady mortgage. My official business was gardening, and of course, I went about pruning lawns, working my magic to let beautiful buds bloom into bountiful, brilliant flowers. I teach neighbours the best way to fend off weeds. That proactivity was always a stronger defence than reactivity. I was nigh on a Flora whisperer. People would have procured some obscure seeds which had no right to be in the country, no planting passport for them, but I'd bury them, I'd nurture them, and I watched as the old lady or the new parents with a penchant for gardening would beam at me in awe. I'd even got myself to a point of renown where I would be invited to guest judge the local garden competitions. A part of me wishes it was enough to don the protective gloves and totter about amongst vast fields of freshly dribbled petrichor, or scuttle about in a greenhouse, snippling and shoveling and tending, like a composer to a symphony orchestra of tall, lithe, talented wonders who, instead of instruments, had mastered the art of scents and colours. But that was my veneer. It's all it ever was. The happy tiller, the friendly neighbour, always smiling, always helpful, the green-handed philanthropist. It was the best way to purchase the tools I needed to do what I wished to do. No one would ever question if they saw me walking home on those long nights where I'd met with difficulty, and the job trickled on into the small hours of the morning, until the white sun peaked above the slate-roofed horizon. They'd assume I'd woken early, had a job. In fact, I'd waved a merry morning to people who sought my advice, while the very bag of green waste swung over my shoulder did not harbour contents quite as innocent as they'd like to believe. And all things considered, I loved my job, my main goal. I'd wait as the soothing twilight simmered and melted into a silent, star-filled, owl-hooting night. Outside my window, I'd see the lights, shaded and altered by the various silky, velvet, or near-translucent curtains on the street, one by one click off like dominoes, as if my neighbours were willingly giving me a signal. "We're crawling into bed now, Stephen. Go about your passion." Then, I'd slip out, silent as the hidden shadows of darkness. I used to ponder that thought often on my journey to the cemeteries, whether people would consider night times to be the lack of life-giving sunlight, or surplus of one, all-consuming shadow. Either way, the darkness was my ally, and we were all acquainted. All of a sudden, my nature expertise was twisted and contorted. It no longer mattered about photosynthesis, because the plants weren't feeding at present. It didn't matter about the arrangements of colours, because all gardens, all trees, all flower beds, and finest roses were just monochrome, dark, creeping bulbs that slept, drooped, and froze, awaiting for the expanding kiss of morning sun to stir them. I'd been to graveyards all over, and my jobs were varied. Your mind would explode if I told you all. Your thoughts and preconceptions scattered to the wind, as if they were drifting seeds of Taraxacum officiale, you'll know it, dispersed at the willful blow of some young child. The profession hadn't changed much through the ages. It was always kept with the secrets of the times, deals made in whispers, contracts drawn in subtext, payments made in donations or under the guise of other work. As I said, I maintained my veneer. A lot of the work was mundane. A skeleton was needed for a medical practice that were budgeting. Dental school professionals wanted to acquire teeth in varying states for some task, or experiment or whatever. I asked very few questions. Other jobs were a little more tinged with drama. Someone had done some research, found my contact deals through some malcontent and told me they have wind of someone being buried with riches beyond what most of us would earn in a lifetime. I'd dig or snoop, and unearth to find either an empty, broken coffin with an undignified scattering of bones in a near-human form, and nothing but dust and wingling, scrambling insects who were furious at being disturbed, so far down as they were. But other times, the wedding ring wreath a spindly brown finger bone, offering no contest as I slipped it off the cold digit. I'd hold it in my palm and bring my eye close to it. They always gleamed, reflecting the dazzle of the distant stars or lurking moon, as if trying to secure their right to beauty, as if they were performing their best so that I would take them with me, find another warm, plump finger to live on. Revelling being a token, a trinket of happiness, or holy matrimony. After all, when a marriage ends, as death do their part, love lives on, and the traditions to unify and celebrate don't cease. I've held in my hands finery beyond description, amulets which open with a groan of disuse to display some faded, barely visible image behind the cracked glass. Necklaces that were so thick that to let them coil in my hand was like finding an entire chest, or some so thin, delicate and fine that it was almost like a single thread, a brittle, frangible thing that seemed to whisper a hushed thanks as it trailed languidly into a light glistering rivulet. Oh, the rings, both band and fixed gem, ruby, sapphire, emerald, diamond, pearl, platinum, fire opal, red berry, jade, were worth more in currency and memories than anything I could find in the most scrumptious antiques dealer's business. The rich in their death dress as fancy as in their life, often even better, as their family want their last impression to reflect the opulent magnificence they commanded in life. The gold-rimmed monocles, the glinting of a rare silver or gold tooth, the bracelets and chains, the anklets and armlets, bangles and cufflinks, brooches and hairpins. When you next walk past the graveyard, an unassuming, consecrated stretch of death, where people consider the plants and trees watered by the echoed tears of endless mourners, I bid you think about what is under that soil, what beauty is wasted, adorned on the tranquil perish. If their soul lives on, they paid their fare to the ferry over the Styx. They've been admitted by St. Peter. They're resting in Valhalla, have been judged and home for eternity, have begun their next life on this cruel, mortal coil, or have withered and rotted in the earth, feeding the cycle of life. Whatever they believed in, they paid their dues and moved on. We romanticise pirates. The more fierce and ruthless, the more infamous they are. Well, I can say with almost certainty that any pirate in the annals of history would never have found, even in their finest trove, the heirlooms and beauty I procured, and I hurt no one in the process. Even the Count of Monte Cristo, with his cave of royal regular, Skeptres, would take time from plotting revenge to pay compliments to this unassuming gardener. However, outside of the medical professionals and treasure hunters, there are also more insidious jobs. Clients who, well, they care not for the practical use of a body, nor for the fine garb or fine jewels, but need the body. These, I must confess, I'm less proud of, but my rates for these types of jobs were astronomical. I'd sometimes unearth bodies that were so fresh, so recently deceased, that as I lifted their limp forms into my vehicle, the flesh cold, pale porcelain, waxen pallid, but still clinging on as if refusing to fade and fizzle, I'd be expecting them to yawn and shift in my grip, as if I'd disturbed their sleep. I always told myself I was ferrying them to their loved ones who wanted to keep them close, bury them in their gardens, or that they had some difficulty with living without them, that I was reuniting what death had torn asunder. This may be the case, but no, it probably wasn't. I tried not to think about it. After all, if the companies and billionaires can operate with impunity, exploiting the masses and infecting the planet, poisoning the seals, polluting the waters, wilting the world, then I can, in a sense, justify the more regretful repercussions of my own. However, upon one simple day, my entire job and life changed. It was on this day I decided that no longer could I continue, because perhaps there are more nefarious deeds at play in this world, and I was in no rush to hurry them on. The night was mild and calm. Wisps of cold lingered across the dark sky, furling into quaint branches, before trailing off and fading to a whisper. The stars glittered, like mocking jewellery I could never pilfer for the love of another, and the pale moon shone, gifting the world below a slivery lime. I had wormed my way around the large part that adjoined the cemetery wall, traversing the grass, which had begun to bathe itself in a gathering dew. My boots were shining, glistening a faint reflection of the moonlight. I clambered all over the wall, and greeted the crude stones. The lurching church with its spire thrusting upwards, as if to touch the hand of God. It was a simple job, just an old skeleton. A female. The employer was someone I'd worked with before, and paid well for a job with little specifics. These were easy jobs. I didn't have to search for a stone, much more difficult when the light is absent, and decades, or centuries, or vandals had effaced the carving. The stone, though strong and unmoving, suffers loss and fades into memory, just like the body it represented. I began trouncing into the more decrepit, less tended far corners of the cemetery, where the bodies had slept through the ages, and all those who loved and mourned their loss were now amongst them in their afterlife, or eternal rest. And soon, I began to go about my exhumation. I had a low, dull lamp, but I'd only switch it on in intervals to avoid detection. The last thing I ever needed was some diligent caretaker or lingering member of piety, or of even miscreant children hanging about the grounds for a blameless night, to spot a glowing orb in the distance and decide to investigate. It had never happened before, and I never knew how I'd react, but I never wanted to know. I'd become a master of observing what was before me when I flashed the dull lamp on, framing it in my mind like a prized landscape, plunging the world into darkness, and then digging until I needed to switch the lamp back on and review. The trees above were hanging low, the dark, colourless boughs and clawed leaves reaching down, hovering above my head and tickling my shoulder like an eager apprentice, desperate to get a better look. Every so often, a wispy and willful gust would play about the grounds, like the spirits of all the long-forgotten children racing and frolicking in the joy life never offered them. The work was slow and hard. The initial dig is much easier around this time, when the ground is softened by the sweet moisture of the night, but after a while, the consistency resolves, and it's a battle between man and earth. I took a moment to breathe, and reached for my canteen. I'd always take a gulp of water, then reach for my flask for a sip of whiskey, never to get tipsy, but to give myself an inner warmth. It always helped, especially in the colder months, but as I brought the silver rim to my lips, I saw a glimmer in the distance, just for a second, as if a star had plummeted to the ground, fallen from grace and was pulsing in the throes of death. I paused, for a moment, as the gust slipped past. From a rush to a hush, I felt my heart booming beneath my ribcage. A flash of all the ribs I'd seen in my career stormed across my mind's eye, but I shook them out, peering in the direction where I saw the sudden, low glimmer. I paused, watching with pulsing anxiety, wondering exactly what it was. It was only there for a moment, and then fizzled into the night. I'd never believed in ghosts. I'd spent endless nights in cemeteries, and was yet to see the echo of a spirit lingering in this world. I decided to place my tools down, and quiet as a cat, ventured over to the general direction, being careful to pay heed to any noise, and scanning the black world of lichen, stone and weeping tree, thinking I may see a silhouette darting from my approach. But nothing. I couldn't exactly pinpoint where the light bloomed, but I leant against a tree, hiding my form behind it, and peering, waiting, wondering. It was difficult to say how long I was there for, as the ghastly zephyrs sailed on by, and the scuttles and shuffling of the wind could be heard here and there. I decided I may have somehow caught the glimpse of a car light in the distance, or even imagined the entire thing. Perhaps the canteen snatched a glimpse of the brilliant moon and reflected it in a quick display that I barely caught it. There was nothing else it could have been, of course. So, I decided to retreat, and meandered my way, taking care not to step on the graves as I did so. I may dig them up for my financial stability, but I still treated them with a reverence. After all, I wouldn't go stepping on people's beds when they were lulled in a slumber, eternal or not. However, when I reached my destination, I was absolutely nonplussed to find an elderly man sitting right there. He was on the edge of the grave, his buttocks resting on the height difference I'd carved, his legs atop the slight cavity. He didn't seem surprised to see me wandering back over. but rather expectant, pleased. Decisions began to flit about my mind: run, deny, attack, confront, but they were quickly deposed when he spoke with a croaky voice. "Hello, son." "Huh?" I managed in response, not quite sure how to go about a casual conversation over a half-dug grave in the dead of the night. Hello?" I finally managed. "I see you're busy here," he went on, reaching forward with great difficulty and placing a leathery, wrinkled hand on the hard soil of my work below. "But I need you to assist me." All I could do was stare. Of the many woes and wonders I'd beheld, something of this nature had never happened, and I was absolutely at a loss on how to respond. "It's clear you're a professional, and I'm just an old man. I have no tools, no strength, no means," he explained, and I couldn't help but hear a profound sadness in his hollow tone. "But I do have means to thank you beyond what you receive for your work, beyond what you've ever experienced." He watched my expression growing from shock to confused, and then, with a mischievous smile which revealed a sparsity of broken teeth, those that were present yellowed and cracked, the gums greyed and black. It quite reminded me of the very graveyard we were in. "And if that promise isn't enough, I also have more money than I need, than you know what to do with." "How much?" I answered, an accident of instinct. My throat was tight, my voice was strange, but my greed was intact and in the driving seat. That stole a chortle from him, one that was neither infectious nor agreeable. He raised a finger as if to pause me. I could see it trembling before him, near to vibration, an old rickety, near skeletal spire. The entire hand was covered in mud, from what I could see in the darkness. You won't complain." And without explanation, "It's a fresh grave. My dear wife, she wasn't supposed to die yet, and I feel quite robbed of what I was due. She was buried not too long ago, and since I was able to flee, I've been here each night, clawing at the soil in what manner I could. Tonight, I decided that I would stop. I'm much too weak alone, and that a gravedigger is what I needed. And well, look what I saw in the corner of this old hollow yard. Just what I needed." He grinned, flashing those teeth again. "I have a way to make the world work for me, son. Your presence here is not an accident. It's not fate. It's not a coincidence. It is my will." "Are you the police?" I asked, unable to process his lunacy, wondering if he was just waiting for incrimination. "Do you have a wire?" He cackled at that. And without further question, reached over to my lamp, flicked it on, and began to undress. He was wearing a velvet suit, a dark crimson red that was torn and frayed, offering solid argument to the more money than he knew what to do with claim. As the buttons undone, he revealed his torso, which was sagged, and as leathery as his hand, mottled and discoloured like old parchment. But the most striking thing about it was the sheer number of tattoos on him. None of them imagery I could deduce, but symbols and signs I surmised runes. He watched as my eyes scrambled across, attempting to read what was beyond my understanding, and he grumbled, "You won't find any sense there, son, nor will you find a wire." Then the light switched off, and even though I was staring at his chest still, I could have sworn he didn't move this time. "Now, follow me." It was a strange sensation. I wasn't actively obeying or refusing, but I suddenly realised all my belongings were in my hands and slung over my shoulder, and I was creeping in his wake, not wanting to flee, yet not wanting to follow. He brought me over to the general direction I saw the flash of light earlier, and then guided me amongst spindly trees with groping limbs, no longer my apprentices, but now old, haggard witches wishing to curse and hex my every step. Following this man suddenly made the world feel cruel, twisted and tainted. Yet, I felt not a semblance of discomfort, his uneasiness within me. If anything, in his presence, I felt untouchable. Finally, we stopped before a tombstone. It was a grand marble option, white stone with black swaths sweeping across it in great, demanding patches. The name etched upon it was, for my best guess, Scandinavian, and try as I might, as soon as I read the word, it wouldn't stick to my memory. I could read it, I could say it in my mind, but the second I took my eyes away, it disappeared from my clasp of knowledge. "Don't worry about that," the stranger told me. "I've already given you a head start. You can get to work and be done quickly." Where's your light?" I asked, "from before." Well, we won't be needing that now you have technology, will we?" Another flash of those horrid teeth. "It's tiring to work alone. It was only with her I could." His voice broke off with a sudden sadness, and he brought the muddled hand to his eye and quietly wept. I took that as a cause to set up my equipment, flashed the light, and was careful not to look upon him again. I dug, and though he said the grave was fresh, it had clearly sat drying and solidifying itself as a true member of the cemetery's inhabitants. As I went about working, he was regaling me with tidbits of a story, how he met his poor late wife overseas, how they travelled the world together, seen more than anyone else could ever claim to have seen over their many years. Through many grunts of effort, he would sit, sometimes adding more to the story, sometimes addressing her directly, and sometimes just humming a slow, discordant tune, peppering it with random lines of lyrics that were in a different language. I felt unsettled for sure, but I still felt safe. There was a sullen, quiet confidence emanating from this man that seemed to electrify the air around him. I felt as if, should a meteor come hurtling down and hit this very spot, the entire world may crumble and break, but he would somehow protect this small patch of earth from the impact. I couldn't quite put sense to my inkling, but something about this man was ethereal. The minutes trickled by as the dirt was carefully ferried to the side. I never flung behind me, as you see in the movies, because it makes it harder to place it back atop. It's usually best to replace it in reverse, keeping the softer mud from sight and the drier soil atop. It's less stark and easier to miss. For newer graves, I'd sometimes cover it with the flowers and teddies, knowing that people wouldn't question a patch decorated by a loving family member. By the way I could compact the soil by now, it's almost rendered that tactic null, only if the graves were close to a path. Before long, the cavity in the ground was deep enough, and I knew soon we would reach the coffin, and the exhumation would begin. For the older coffins, this was hardly an issue. They would clatter and crumble as soon as they were met with some weight, or even be degraded to something soft and spongy splinters, more fractured than the skeleton they were created to contain. But this time, when I heard the hollow knock of metal on wood, I froze, because I'd never done this in front of someone before. I'd be as respectful as possible alone, but there was no way to open a coffin without stepping on top of it, unless I dug out little roots and mastered some agility that I didn't know I had. To buy time, I reached for my bag and began to fumble about for the tools I'd need to unclasp the latches and pry the cover open. Yet, without a word, without even an utterance, I heard his voice call from above. "Do what needs to be done, son," he said, simple as if I was cooking him a nice meal. Neither of us would begrudge a muddled footprint on an early coffin. The coffin was magnificent. The varnished wood a perfect stage for the moon's reflection to simmer upon. There was a clear level of craftsmanship that was rare to see. Across the perimeter of the lid, more strange and illegible, to me at least, symbols and runes scattered across like a decoration, a filigree of opulence. It felt almost a shame to break it open, as exquisite as it was. But as I looked back to the man, still humming a dolorous tune to the yard of the deceased, his leering eyes and great smile urged me to continue. I went about dislodging the latches, and carefully, as respectfully as one could in the circumstances, wedged my trusted crowbar between the cleat, and with great force began to pry the resting box open. Older coffins, though nailed shut, were often easier due to their lack of quality. The newer ones often had slats or latches or sealant. Though technically easier, it still required a lot of physical strength to open, and I often owed my success to the fear of creeping daylight, or nightly wanderer instilling me with adrenaline enough to open it. But, try as I might, The lid wouldn't shift. I shuffled my position and angled multiple times, and I could feel the man's gaze burrowing into the back of my skull, impatient and anxious, before finally, he snapped a vicious, "Just get it done." Whether this was the motivation I needed, or whether the coffin's integrity crumbled beneath his demand, the lid flung open and smacked against the hard wall of soil with a thud that caused a cloud of dirt to pepper on the corpse below. I was pulled, like a kitten by a cat, from where I stood, my entire weight suddenly irrelevant and meaningless before being placed on the side. The sudden jolt disorientated me slightly, but as I regained balance and sense, I looked, confused and bewildered, on the scene before me. The man had already whipped back the funeral shroud, a heavy cloth that had great loops of divine gold thread trim. Beneath it was her body, the face a hollow, pallid white that seemed to shine brighter than the great moon above, the solitary light bearer in the world of darkness. There were no signs of decomposition, but the makeup they often decorate the visage of the late soul had either faded or never been applied. The lips were a frigid blue, cracked and caked. Her body was covered with a regal dress, seemingly the same colour and the same velvet that the man's suit was tailored from. She looked to be the same age as him. Little shallows tucked beneath the wrinkles, and her hair was a wiry, bristling nettle brush, strands of silver which looked more like metal than silk. The man's hand caressed her face with a gentle, loving hand, and he began whispering, just loud enough for me to realise it wasn't English. He planted a long and dry kiss on her wrinkled brow, and then in one sudden movement, he pulled down the neck of her velvet dress to reveal a chest as littered with markings as his own. "The necklace," he spat. "They've took the necklace." His hands moved in a panic blur, patting about her in a wild frenzy. "I'll curse them. I'll wither their family tree to a wilted branch. I'll cast every last one of them to the depths of hell." The way he spoke those words forced a spine-chilling shiver to grip me and rattled me from within. They weren't just creative threats, they were promises, and for some reason I knew it. He slumped down, cradling her lifeless head in his hand, and from his hunched form fell deep, despairing sobs. "Lazarus, Lazarus, your necklace is no more." "Wait," I heard myself speak, before the words had even formed in my mind. "If you weren't there for the burial..." I quickly dismissed any nefarious reason this could have been, because whether this was a woman the man loved, or he was just here for some heirloom or trinket, I didn't want to question or inject myself in the narrative. I wanted to help and be gone. "You may have missed where they put it. It's not always..." I trailed off, as he was mumbling about Lazarus, but slipping from all manner of languages. I lowered myself cautiously, and the man snarled at me, showing those terrible teeth once more. But the flash of protective anger in his eyes was what rooted me. He searched me for a fraction of a second with that demonic glance, before snapping back to a more controlled countenance. And, though no explicitly offering me permission, he angled himself as if to watch. As I reached, he spoke. "Do not touch her flesh with your kinds." I heeded his words gratefully, and, as dexterously, as delicately as humanly possible, trying not to look at the corpse's face just inches from my own, I reached behind the head to where the cushioned pillow propped it up. I knew it was a common practice that actually stemmed from my very professional, and somehow trickled into modern tradition, to place items of worth in a little sack and tuck it behind or next to the pillow. This was no different. Before long, I retrieved a small pouch. Again, the fabric was the same strange velvet as his suit. Her dress, and the little rope that tied it shut, was of a golden hue. I passed it to him, and quickly clambered out the grave just waiting. I could see fear on his face, and he closed his eyes whilst uttering what could only have been a prayer, or something of that ilk. He carefully untied the rope, and ventured a wrinkled talon into the pouch, and as if handling a lizard, procured the most beautiful necklace I'd seen in all my life. It was a simple thing, just a thin silver chain with a pendant of emerald, but something about it seemed simply godly, as if I was lucky enough to lay eyes upon the Holy Grail, or something of similar worth and rarity. The emerald within was hardly sizable, but it still winked a stunning flash, and I realised it wasn't a reflection, but a property of the jewel itself. This thing, almost certainly, was not of this world. Yet there it lay, in the open palm of this wanderer. Quickly, his hand clasped about it and began to snake the thin sliver chain around his fingers, scrutinising the silky silver with a meticulous gaze. "Of course," he muttered aloud. "It broke." He brought the two loose ends together and placed them between his thumb and forefinger, and with a slight, almost unnoticeable rotating motion, there was a gasp and a hiss of smoke, which drifted upwards, trailing into the peaceful nothingness of the dark canopy above. He then let the silver chain drop, holding the pendant flat once more, and that flesh began pulsing a steady rhythmic. Upon this, he proceeded to fall to his knees, weeping, completely overcome with emotion, and waiting with an ecstatic joy. I glanced around, terrified of the sudden sound, as if a klaxon to anyone nearby. But, in a vexing realisation, I noticed that as soon as I turned away from him, the sound ceased. Everything was still. Behind us, just a silent, silver-kissed cemetery lay, unassuming and undisturbed. I forced a quick glance at the great church windows, their stained glass undiscernible in the gloom, then turned back. Nothing. The grave was empty. The man was gone. The corpse had disappeared. All that lay in the centre was the small velvet pouch, bunched and open enough for me to see other items of jewellery within. Even from this quick glance, I could tell that they were priceless, but, unlike the simple necklace, they were more fitting with what I'd seen before. They were exquisite, but unearthly. A brush of wind tousled my hair and caused a storm of goose pimples to envelope me. I held tight to my clothing, waiting for the charged gust to fade, until I heard, almost hidden beneath the rushing air, "Your assistance served me, and so I serve you. Take the treasure as your own for this world, and know, as you saved mine, I will save yours from the next." I shuddered uncontrollably, and it didn't stop, despite the tepid warmth of the night. I couldn't help but think that this was a reaction to hearing a bodiless voice, like a touch from beyond some guarded veil. I glanced around, as if to find the voice, even though I knew it was borne on the spectral wind. Yet, as I peered in the distance, I saw two whisked silhouettes, hand in hand, fading into a gathering fog that was certainly not existent just moments before. I took the jury as bid, fearing retribution if I didn't. But I've kept the dazzling wonders from ages lost in memory and clouded by history sealed, away from family and myself since. I refuse to get them valued, even though there is a distinctive wealth beyond my imagination, where I do just that. I've also gone full time as a gardener, refusing to work in cemeteries, even for simple upkeep, even in the brightest days of blistering summer. No matter how hollowed, how warm, how just the circumstances may be, to think of that encounter is enough to imbue me with a fit of shudders and discomfort. I will not be caught in one alone. And, as the man, being, thing promised is forever etched in the forefront of my conscience and conscious mind, I'm starting to think that even the death of my own loved ones will no longer be a reason to be found, donned in black bereavement, nurturing the grass I stand on with my own tragic tears. I dread their death, but in a way no other soul could ever understand.